I'm going to be talking a lot today about the importance of having good information. I find that one of the things that distinguishes people who do well at a property investment and those who get less than ideal results is in terms of their access to good information and good advice. So yeah, today I'm going to be speaking to you on the basis of my more than 30 years experience in real estate investment, research and writing about the subject of Australian real estate, during which time I've published 4 books and written a lot in media and appearing also a lot in media as an interview subject on television, radio and in newspapers. I'm going to be talking a lot about the importance of information and also the great problem that faces real estate owners everywhere in Australia, which is what I call the misinformation minefield, largely through media. I often refer in my various broadcasts and writing to what I call the great seething mass of media misinformation, which I see as the biggest problem facing people who want to be in property investment and real estate consumers of all sorts, whether they be buyers and sellers, home buyers or investors. There is just so much misinformation out there in the media, and it's the thing that causes people to get less than ideal results, I think, more than anything else in property investment. Now, I do know people who have been very successful with it. Some that I know and are customers of ours who have probably portfolios worth tens of millions of dollars. And many of these are our premium members. That means that people who get access to all the reports that we publish via the hotspotting.com.au website. And that means that they have access to a flow of really good information to help to make good decisions in real estate. Another of the distinguishing features, people who achieve fabulous success as opposed to those who get ordinary results or poor results, they do one thing differently. That is that they treat real estate investment as a business, not as a hobby. And I think most people treat it as a hobby, which means that that's something that they do in their spare time. Whereas those who take investment seriously and succeed with it, treat it as a business. They'll often have a day job or a business that they own and operate, but they also treat property investment as a second business. That means they're willing to put time and resources into doing property investment well. I have mentoring clients, people that I take through a step-by-step process, holding their hand through the process of achieving good results with property investments. Now, my mentoring clients, I take through an 8-step process. And to succeed with property investment, you need to start with step 1 and work through steps 2, 3, 4, etc. But what most people do is they start their quest for property investment in what I call step 7. Step 7 is actually looking for something to buy, an investment property to buy. And a lot of people begin with that. They get excited about the idea of being a property investor, so they start immediately looking online at properties that are for sale, looking for things to buy without doing the preliminary steps, which are necessary for them to develop a good strategy, understand what their objectives are, understand their borrowing capacity, their risk profile, and all the things that need to happen before you actually start actively looking for things to buy. And those that skip those earlier steps 1 through to 6 and go straight to step 7, they often encounter all sorts of problems. I get messages every day in various forms, through email, through text messages, through phone calls, people who've got questions largely relating to problems that they've encountered in the property investment process, and many of them are overwhelmed because there's too many choices, too many locations to choose from, lots of conflicting advice, lots of conflicting information in the media, and they really don't know what to believe, who to trust. A lot of people get very impatient when they decide they want to get into property investment. Instantly, they're looking for something to buy. They want to buy something now, and they don't want to do a lot of work. And that's an approach that's likely to lead to bad results, if not to outright failure in the property investment process. A lot of people have a lot of fear, not knowing how to get started, worried about what they're reading in the media about the downturn or the bubble bursting, all kinds of media misinterpretation and misinformation that's there on almost a daily basis. These are all problems that people face when they are perhaps take a rushed approach to property investment, not doing it the right way, not doing the necessary preliminary steps before they start looking for things to buy. Now, there's an old adage in real estate that you make your money when you buy, not when you sell. And that means buying at a really good price. But most people don't buy at a great price because they buy at the wrong time. And that's because we're herd animals. People are more likely to dive into a market and look for something to buy when they read that there's a boom on. Because basically we're herd animals. We like the comfort of the herd. If everybody's doing it, it must be right. So people are more likely to buy in a market that everyone's piling into, because there's news that there's a boom happening in that market, rather than doing proper research, getting good advice, identifying the areas that are going to show growth, and buying ahead of the price rises. In other words, buying at the right time and buying at a right price. Very few people do that. It requires you to think and act counter-cyclically to get the best results, but most people don't. So the 8-path process that I talked about, that I work through with my mentoring clients, the people that I help develop strategies and successful results in property investment, the very first step is to know your objective, because if you don't know your objective, you can't develop a strategy to achieve that objective. And if you don't have a good strategy, you're not going to be getting good results. You're not going to be buying the right properties in the right place. So if you don't know your goal, you're going to be asking often the wrong questions. You're going to end up with the wrong answers. Now, a couple of years ago, I was at a home show in Melbourne, where I made available short interviews with people who want to come and have a chat about their most pressing issues with their property investing process. Just 15-minute time slots where people could sit down and ask me key questions. And there was one particular couple I remember who was overwhelmed because they just didn't know how to get started. And there were just too many choices. They were looking all over Australia, too many locations, too many properties for sale, too much conflicting information. And the reason why they're so overwhelmed is they hadn't done those preliminary steps. They hadn't thought about their objectives. And out of that, they hadn't developed a strategy. They hadn't understood their borrowing capacity and their risk profile. And I took them through a very simple process where I asked them those key questions. What are your goals? What are your attitudes to risk? How much can you afford to spend? What's your strategy? And very quickly their list of choices was reduced from the whole of Australia down to a small manageable number of key locations that fitted their profile, that fitted the price range that they're able to buy in, and made the process so much easier for them. And they were converted in the space of about 15 minutes from being overwhelmed to being inspired, just by understanding those earlier processes that you need to go through before you start actually actively looking for things to buy as property investors. To get the right answers, you really need to be asking the right questions, and far too many investors ask the wrong questions. And one of the questions I get asked a lot, and which I think is the wrong question, is this a good time to buy? And for me, a much better question that people could be asking is, where is it a good time to buy? Because of the size of Australia and the fact that we don't have one property market in Australia, we have a series of different property markets. They're not all doing the same thing. They're not all moving in the same direction. They're not all moving at the same speed. And because of that, it's highly likely that at any given point in time, there's going to be somewhere where it's a really great time to buy. So the key question is, where is it a right time to buy? Where is it best to buy right now? So some of the questions that a property investor starting out might usefully ask is why did Sydney rise so strongly, but Canberra, only about 3 hours down the road from Sydney, Canberra didn't? Why at the same time as Sydney and Melbourne were rising so strongly was Perth in a slump? And why has there been relatively little growth in cities like Brisbane and Adelaide? And the answer to that question in simple terms is that we don't have an Australian property market. We have individual markets. Even within a single city, we have individual markets not always doing We don't have everything happening in the Sydney market at the one time. There's different sectors, different price ranges, different geographical locations that all do different things. And we find in our research that market outcomes are primarily dictated by the local conditions. It's the local economic conditions. It's not national factors. We often find that economists tend to talk about Australia as a single market, which is a mistake. And they tend to talk about national factors like the level of interest rates, record low interest rates being a prime factor for what's happening in real estate, but that doesn't explain why so many differences. If record low interest rates drove the Sydney boom, why didn't it drive a boom in Perth where prices have been going backwards, or in Darwin where the same thing has been happening? A lot of talk about tax benefits like negative gearing as being a major influence. Those factors exist across Australia, yet we have all these different local outcomes. And the reason for that is that it's really about what's happening with the local economy. Is the economy thriving? Is it creating jobs? Is there a high level of spending on infrastructure? And out of all that comes demand for real estate. So continuing that theme, understanding why some markets rise and others don't at any given point in time. Let's have a look at Sydney and why it has been the number one property market for most past 4 to 5 years, although obviously now winding down, having passed its peak. But the things that drove that Sydney boom was that the state economy of New South Wales has been the number one economy by some margin for most of the period of time that Sydney's property market has been booming. Now, up until about 2011, the New South Wales economy ranked towards the bottom. CommSec, as one example, puts out a quarterly report where they rank the state and territory economies from 1 to 8. And up until about 2011, New South Wales ranked right down towards the bottom 7th or 8th. It was a very poor performing economy. There was an election in 2011, a change of government, and the new government started regenerating the economy and spending on infrastructure. And very quickly, the New South Wales economy was elevated from down the bottom of the rankings right up towards the top. And out of that, I believe, came the Sydney real estate boom, working in conjunction with other factors. Big spending on infrastructure has been part of effectively Sydney. Prior to that 2011 election, state election in New South Wales, there was very little spending on infrastructure in Sydney, something it desperately needed. Over the past 5 or 6 years, we've seen a big change in that regard. So now we have more happening in terms of new infrastructure, particularly transport infrastructure, in Sydney than anywhere else in Australia. In fact, probably more happening in Sydney right now in that regard than all the other capital cities combined. So infrastructure spending is just so important. It generates economic activity. It creates many thousands of jobs. And at the same time, particularly when we're talking about transport infrastructure, improves the amenity or the appeal of locations by improving access, making it faster and easier to get to locations. That an example of that is the Sydney Metro Northwest Rail Link, which is bringing new rail services to parts of Sydney that haven't previously had those services, and that's going to have a major impact on the appeal of those markets, as well as at the same time generating the economic activity that a project of this magnitude, $10 or $12 billion project, and the many thousands of jobs that it generates, all of that feeds into the mix of the local economy and creates demand for real estate. So it's an incredibly important factor to look for when you're doing your research as property investors. So Melbourne has also been going pretty well, a little bit behind Sydney in the cycle. So it's perhaps still got a little bit more to run than Sydney does, but definitely past its peak and winding down. But we see similar factors in play when we look at why Melbourne, because Sydney and Melbourne really have been kind of exclusively having a real estate boom when the other 6 state territory capital cities haven't. Some of them have been going backwards and some of them have been fairly stagnant. But these 2 markets, Sydney and Melbourne, have been thriving. And it all relates to what's going on in the local economy, because while New South Wales has definitely been the number 1 economy in the nation for the past 5 or 6 years, Victoria is ranked number 2 pretty consistently behind New South Wales, and more recently challenging New South Wales for that number 1 slot, according to some of those people like CommSec, who publish their quarterly reports on the subject. One of the big things for Melbourne, of course, is that it's the #1 location in Australia for population growth. Victoria and Melbourne. Melbourne's the leader nationally for overseas migrants. It's #2 for net gains from interstate migration. Those are big factors feeding into a strong state economy, which has driven the uplift in the Melbourne property market. It's been helped to a certain extent by the fact that it has been a bit more affordable than Sydney. For example, residential land prices in Melbourne well below those of Sydney, although they have risen a lot in the last 12 months. But we're now seeing sales activity winding down as no boom lasts forever, and after 3 to 4 years, generally we see a boom cycle runs its course, plateaus out and starts to wind down. We have a period of perhaps a small correction in prices before moving into the next cycle. Part of the evidence that Melbourne is close to the end of its cycle is the fact that the most active markets right now are those outer-ring areas, the cheaper areas on the northern fringes, the southeastern fringes, and also in the southwest and in the far west. So local government areas like Melton, way up in the west, are thriving at the moment. They're the areas with the highest activity and the greatest price growth. Also Wyndham City in the southwest, heading down towards Melbourne, down towards Geelong rather, and areas up in the north, the Whittlesea local government area around Epping and nearby suburbs, very, very strong recently. But it's a signal that Melbourne's close to the end of its cycle, that those outer areas are the ones that are doing the best right now, because boom cycles usually start in the centre and over time they ripple out to the middle ring suburbs and then the outer ring suburbs, and that's where we are now with Melbourne, and we're beyond that with Sydney. Right now, Hobart is the hottest city market. As Sydney and Melbourne has run down, Hobart's taken over a number of the key measurements by which we chart the health or otherwise of property markets. Homes are selling fastest in Hobart, faster there than anywhere else in Australia. It's got the lowest vacancies. It's had that mantle for quite a long time. It's got the best rental yields as a result of having very low vacancies and relatively high rentals relative to prices. It's now the only city that, in terms of the generalised data, is achieving double-digit price growth. Still going very strong. So one of the key questions, of course, is where next? What's going to be the next boom city? And there's one particular city that also has, like Hobart, consistently low vacancies. It has the best rental growth in the nation, and it's forecast by some to have the highest price growth over the next 2 to 3 years, and that city is Canberra. And there is evidence that Canberra is pretty solid. It's cranking up as Sydney winds down. Canberra is tending to rise, and so we're starting to see increased price growth on the back of its low unemployment. It's also a very strong economy. It generally ranks #3 in the nation in the CommSec State of the States report that's published quarterly. It's usually New South Wales 1, Victoria 2, and the ACT 3. So strong economy, low unemployment. Tends to have the highest average incomes in the nation. That helps. Vacancies are very... it's logical to expect that we're going to see some pretty solid price growth over the next few years, and certainly some observers are predicting it's going to lead the nation on price growth. I'm not sure whether it will lead, but it'll certainly be up there, I think. Just a reminder to people out there watching and listening that if you have any questions, you can type those questions into the Q&A or the chat box there, and at the end of the presentation I'll endeavour to answer some of the questions that have come through while I'm doing my presentation. So those are some of the key factors that are happening in the major markets around Australia. I'll talk a little bit more about what's coming, areas that I expect to do best going forward. But some key questions that I think are pertinent to ask those of you who are interested in property investment, such as, are you conducting daily research on the market? Do you have lots of free time to conduct that research, or are you paying someone else to do the legwork for you? If you're not putting in a lot of time yourself, excuse me, in terms of research, or you're not paying someone else to do that legwork research for you, then your chances of succeeding with property investment are pretty poor. You need to be putting in time yourself, or you need to be allocating resources and getting good advice and good information and being willing to pay for it. One or the other, preferably both. But if you're not doing either, then your chances of success with property investment are a little bit limited. Because the kind of attitude that I find is common amongst property investors is that they have a willingness to spend, say, $500,000 to buy an investment property, but they're not willing to spend $50 on a research report or $500 on a valuation to make sure that the property that they're buying is at the right price. And they certainly won't spend $5,000 accessing good advice and good information so that they can go about property investment the right way and get good results. But they will spend the $500,000, and it's wildly illogical in my view. It's a very it's false economy to try to save on those small amounts while being willing to spend the big amount on an investment property. Because if you don't spend the small amounts on research and advice and getting valuation to make sure you're buying at the right price, then the chances are that the property you're spending the big money on might be the wrong property in the wrong location. And so many people have had that outcome, unfortunately, as property investors over the last few years. So my contention is that there is a better way. Those people who get the best results are people who treat property investment as a business. They build a team, they have access to good advice, they have a good accountant who understands real estate, they have a good mortgage broker that they go to advice on getting the best lending, borrowing packages. They have people they go to for good information, such as my business, hotspotting.com.au. Premium members have access to a flow of good information that helps them make good decisions. But I think that's the approach you have to take if you want to be successful with property investment. If you're taking a penny pinching approach, you don't want to spend money on advice and information, your chances of getting good outcomes when you spend a big amount of money are somewhat limited. So the investors I know with large portfolios and successful outcomes and property that's growing in value, setting them up for a strong financial future, early retirement perhaps, those are the people that seek expert advice. They have a range of advisors that they trust and know and go to whenever they're attempting property investment. And they tend to get much better outcomes than the average punter out there that is unwilling to put in time or money. So research is the key. I would suggest having access to really good, excellent, in fact, information is so pivotal in terms of whether you're going to success or not. But unfortunately, getting good information is one of the hardest things to achieve in property investment. And one of the reasons is that most people access their information from mainstream media, which is a mistake, I would suggest. Because I think if you're tapping into newspapers and other forms of mainstream media as your main source of information about what's going on in residential real estate, you're going to be filling your heads with misinformation and myths and misconceptions, and leading to bad decisions. There was some research done not so long ago which looked at the content of our major newspapers and found that about 60% of the overall content of newspapers was actually generated by press releases, which means that it's a piece of propaganda that someone sent into the newspaper hoping to get publicity for themselves or their business or their political viewpoint. And according to this research, about 60% of the content of newspapers was generated by that kind of material. And I would estimate that when it comes to real estate coverage, it's not 60%, it's close to 90%. And the result is what I call the great seething mass of media misinformation. Because most of the articles that are written in newspapers like the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Age, the Courier Mail in Brisbane, etc., it's mostly recycled press releases. The major media organisations have been sacking journalists by the thousands over recent years. Those that remain don't have the time and resources to do their jobs properly, So it becomes pretty much an exercise in recycling press releases. So it's somebody's propaganda. A lot of the news feeds that you can access out there is basically just a collection of press releases from real estate agents and developers, putting forward messages in which they have a vested interest. So it's not what you'd call quality information. If you're basing major spending decisions on this kind of information, you're likely to be making bad decisions. So, and the people who make that mistake, and it's alarming how many people read something in a newspaper and then go out and make a major investment decision, and find out too late that the decision they made is a bad one. We get communications every day from people, many of them from people who have got themselves into a difficult situation through making a bad decision. Here's an example of an email. Somebody who, with their partner, were talked into buying an off-the-plan apartment in Melbourne. They paid too much, and then found that it was worth a lot less than they paid. It dropped in value. Now realise that this apartment was, as she says, such a bad idea, and that we were pushed into it. Another one of those traps that are out there for investors: don't have access to good advice and good information. Here was somebody who had a financial advisor in Sydney, where Jenny was based, telling them that they should be buying an apartment in Fortitude Valley in central Brisbane. And she was very worried because she was approaching retirement and couldn't afford to get it wrong. What she probably didn't realise was that financial advisor was recommending that particular location and that particular development because they stand to get a major kickback if their client signs up and buys an apartment there. Otherwise, they get a commission. So they have a vested interest in this very, very bad advice. Fortitude Valley is one of those oversupplied markets in the Brisbane inner city apartment market. Vacancy is very high. Values are falling, and I sincerely hope that Jenny didn't go ahead with that purchase, because if she did, she would have bought something that is now worth less than she paid. Far too much of that going on. A lot of people bought into resources-related boom markets 4, 5, 6 years ago, places like Gladstone, where initially the market was rising because it was a boom economy, but developers flooded the market with too much new product and causing vacancies to rise, rents to fall, values to fall, and a lot of people who bought there have a very, very bad result. Didn't do proper research, didn't understand the dynamics of that market, and didn't get good advice. So some people were buying there directly off bad advice, and found that eventually the market started to slide because of oversupply, and found themselves with properties worth a lot less than they'd paid. Those are all outcomes of people making what I think is the biggest mistake that most investors make: buying in the wrong places. And some people not only buy in the wrong place, but they buy multiple properties in that one location. That's an aerial view of Gladstone, and it's amazing how many people not only bought in Gladstone, but they bought multiple properties in Gladstone. And also in the famous coal mining town of Moranbah, which at one point was the most amazing sort of boom property market in Australia. It rose and it rose and it rose, but it went too high, and then things changed in the resources sector and value started to fall. And there are people out there who own multiple properties in either Gladstone or Moranbah or both, and are suffering as a consequence. So just to give you an idea of why you need to be very careful about what you believe, about what you read in newspapers. A lot of people think if they read an article that says Sydney house prices have grown by 7%, for example, in the last 12 months, that's factual information they can trust. But the reality is that that's just the picture according to one source. Another source will come out for figures for the same market that are quite different. So what I have on screen at the moment is annual growth in house prices last year in the 8 capital cities, according to 3 different sources. And you can see if you study that table that there's a wide variation in how much prices have grown. In Canberra, for example, according to one source, last year house prices grew 18%, but another source said 8%, and another source said 5%. For Melbourne, one source said 23.6%, another said 11%, another said 8%. Now, how can they all be right? How can there be so much variation when they're all talking about something that should be a matter of fact, how much the house prices grow in Melbourne? The answer is that it all depends on their methodology, how good they are at what they do. We just get these wildly different results. So we have a situation where, according to one source, CoreLogic, Sydney prices last year overall price growth fell to almost zero, whereas demand was saying 4%, and SQM research was saying it's still growing at 7%. So how can it be so many differences? Andrew Wilson, who until quite recently was the chief economist for Domain, told me that at Domain they could get a different result depending on which methodology they used. They could come up with a growth figure for Sydney in annual terms of 4%, 10% or 15%, depending on the different methodologies they might use. So the message there is that you cannot place blind faith in the sort of real estate statistics that are published in media based on reputable research sources. I'm not saying that they're bad at what they do, it's just that because of different methodology and because of the difficulties of trying to distill all the activity in a major city like Sydney down to a single growth figure, it's a process that's fraught with difficulty, and a lot of it's rubbery figures. Some organisations like to publish monthly changes in price data. I think it's too short a time frame, that we should only be talking about quarterly changes or even annual changes, but monthly, too short a time frame. And if that chart on the screen lists the month-to-month changes according to CoreLogic, and you can see that in some cities it's all over the place. Perth, 0, then there's a negative result in February, then there's a positive result in March, and there's a negative result for 2 months, and then there's a positive result, then there's a few months of negative results, and there's another month with a positive result. There's no clear pattern there because it's too short a time frame. It's meaningless, but these organisations publish these figures to generate publicity for themselves. Media loves to publish, but what they do is mislead people and just create enormous confusion about what's really going on in our major property markets. And it's even worse now because now they're starting to publish weekly changes. I mean, it's quite ludicrous to think that you can chart patterns in markets on a weekly basis. On the screen is headlines that resulted in 4 consecutive weeks late last year. One week we've got home values are flat across the capital cities. The following week, home values are on the rise according to the weekly change figures. The following week, home values are falling, and the following week, home values are rising again. And it's just rubbish. It's not designed to inform US consumers about what's going on. It's all about publicity generation, and media really should know better than to publish this rubbish, but they do publish it because it's an easy headline. Quite often, I think you're better off not reading newspapers at all. I think the dodgiest data of all out there in real estate is auction clearance rates. The rule of thumb based on my research and also some research that was done recently by Louis Christopher of SQM Research, the published figures for auction clearance rates are inflated because they're reliant on agents to report their results, and agents are more likely to phone in the results if they had a success than if they've had a failure. So many of the failed auctions don't get reported and aren't included in the figures. I think you need to get a true clearance rate, you should deduct 12 or 15 points from the published clearance rates, which means that as an example of that, in late last year, in one particular weekend, there were 836 auctions in Sydney, and the claimed clearance rate was 76%. But there were 239 auction results that weren't reported. And by the time you included those results in the figures, and most of them were the ones that didn't result in a sale, the true clearance rate was actually 62%, so 14 points lower than the published one. So you want to know the true clearance rate is in Sydney and Melbourne or elsewhere that you see published in media, usually on a Monday after each weekend of auctions. Deduct 12 or 15 points to get the true clearance rate. And what that means is right now in Sydney, about half of all properties put to auction are not selling. So for all these reasons above, I often tell investors, if you want to be well informed, stop reading newspapers. You've got to find better sources of good information so that you can make good decisions and get good outcomes as property investors. So moving on to some of the things that we do to inform our customers, our premium members and our mentoring clients. And it's all based on the belief that where you buy is more important than what you buy or when you buy. Now, what you buy is important, when you buy is also important, but the most important thing of all is where you choose to buy. I want to show you one of the methods we use. We look at growth markets, and we try to identify growth markets by a couple of different methods. One that takes a short-term view, another method that takes a longer-term view. The short-term view is a great way to know where prices are going to rise in the short term. It's a very simple method, something that on a quarterly basis, and it's based on charting sales volumes. Because what we found from our research and our experience over time, that a rise in prices is preceded by a rise in sales activity. But there's a time lag. Sales activity will rise first, and maybe 6 to 9 months later, we'll start to see that rise in activity translating into growth in prices in that area. But you have to know, you have to have a method of determining the areas where prices are growing. Now, using that simple method has allowed us to chart many of the trends that have happened in real estate in the last, say, 12 months. We were able ahead of time to predict the boom that's happening now in Hobart. We were able ahead of the media to chart the impending wind down in the Sydney market, the upturn that we now see underway in Canberra, the boom that the Sunshine Coast has experienced. We certainly saw that showing up in the sales volumes data before prices started to rise there. The recovery that's now underway in the Perth market is something that we've charted by looking at sales activity figures, and the oversupply in the Brisbane unit market, which means that over the past 3 or more years, we've been warning people to stay out of that market. We could see what was happening there through this research that we do. Now, just to give you some examples, one of the greatest boom markets in all of Australia in the last couple of years has been the Brimbank local government area in the west, in the suburbs of Melbourne, suburbs such as Sunshine and Sunshine North. Now, we were able to predict the impending price boom in suburbs like Sunshine North because we were charting, 3 years ago, in 2014, we were charting the pattern, the upturn in sales activity. So in 6 consecutive quarters, as you see on screen, the number of sales in that market rose from 28 to 36 to 45 to 62 to 66. Now, when you got that sort of pattern where there's a big uplift in the number of sales that are happening, inevitably that's going to lead to price growth. And at the time, back in 2014, annual price growth was only 4%, and the median price was around 400,000 in Sunshine North. Fast forward 3 years, on the back of that upturn in activity, prices have grown a lot. Last year, they grew 17%, and the median price in that market now is $600,000. So it's increased 50% in 3 years on the back of that upturn in sales activity. Another example, BOWRAL in the Southern Highlands, just outside of Sydney. We noticed in 2014 that same pattern, an upturn in sales activity. In consecutive quarters, the number of sales in that market rose from 71 to 94 to 108 to 113. At the time, there was price growth, but it was somewhat muted. But on the back of that upturn in activity, price growth accelerated. And so we've seen in 2017 a 16% rise in the median price. And now the median price, which 3 years earlier was 600,000, is now over 900,000. So again, an increase of over 50% in 3 years on the back of an upturn in sales activity. So that's what we look for. That's one of the methods we use to determine the locations that are going to grow property value, their property values. Now, how can you do it? Well, it's not easy for individuals to do it because you've got to access the raw data, which is expensive. You've got to spend a lot of time, weeks and months, analysing the sales figures. But we do it for you. You can get reports from us that incorporate this priceless information. So it's one of the benefits of being one of our customers, that you can access reports that uses this methodology to identify the areas that are going to grow in value. Now, taking a longer term view, we're doing a daily research exercise to try and identify the areas that are going to show good long-term growth. And we're looking at all sorts of factors to identify the future hotspots and also the future no-go zones. We're looking for factors such as the ones that we use to determine ahead of time the impending boom in Hobart. As it was 2 to 3 years ago, we were starting to get excited about Hobart and telling our customers that this is a market to get into. It was very affordable, the cheapest capital city in Australia. And we could see that after many years of non-performance that Hobart was about to change. And that was because there were major changes in the Tasmanian economy that were very positive. Population was growing again. There was more stability in the state government. There was spending on infrastructure, and we're also seeing that upturn in market activity, the sales activity that we were charting quarter by quarter. And we put all of that together to forecast 2 to 3 years ago that we were going to have a boom in prices in Hobart. And right now, in the last 12 months, whereas Sydney growth has dropped down to almost zero in annual terms, and Melbourne's now down below 10%, Hobart's still in double digits and still going strong. So where next? Well, there's lots of places to consider. Brisbane's been a bit of an underachiever. While Sydney and Melbourne have been booming, Brisbane hasn't done much, and one of the chief reasons for that is that the underlying economy has been somewhat lukewarm. But there are signs of that changing. The economy is reviving. Queensland's creating more jobs than any other states in recent times. The resources sector's coming back. Population growth figures, particularly net interstate migration, is starting to favour southeast Queensland again. So for those reasons, we think we're going to see better performance in Brisbane moving forward. Perth has been through a difficult downturn, again because of factors in the local economy there, largely related to the end of the resources investment boom that had driven boom in the Western Australian economy. When that came to an end, the Perth property market suffered, but it's now showing signs of recovery, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Adelaide, I think, is very underrated. The state economy, the South Australian economy is improving. It's much stronger than people realise, and the Adelaide market is more worthy of consideration, I think, than people realise. On the back of that rising state economy, all sorts of reasons why Adelaide is a market to consider, including great value for money, much cheaper than many of the other cities. And that state economy is starting to become much stronger. Many regional areas are doing very well now. In New South Wales, as Sydney winds down, many of the regional areas of New South Wales are strong. Newcastle's been very strong in the last 1 to 2 years. The Central Coast and other markets are starting to show signs of rising strongly as well, including Dubbo, Wagga Wagga, Orange, Tamworth. Many of those strong, solid regional cities in New South Wales are worth considering right now. And also in Victoria, seeing a lot of the growth that we're seeing in the Melbourne market rippling out to regional areas that are close to Melbourne. There's also a population drift out of Melbourne towards some of those regional areas. Geelong is a standout example, but also some of the hill change towns north of Melbourne. Ballarat's coming very strong as a regional city that's got a lot going for it. So there's plenty of places in regional Australia to consider right now. Perth we see as a city of opportunity because after 4 difficult years in which prices and rents fell, it's now on the comeback trail. And we've seen the number of growth suburbs. We're charting again sales volumes quarter by quarter. 18 months ago, there were no growth suburbs in Perth. And gradually, quarter by quarter, we're seeing a steady uplift in the number of suburbs with growing sales activity. Obviously, lead to price growth. And one of the manifestations of the recovery in Perth is that the upper end of the market is now starting to show strong price growth, which is often a signal that a cycle is starting, because the cycle often starts at the top end and filters out across the city over a period of 2 or 3 years. So, yeah. Those are some of the things that we look for, some of the things that we do, the daily research exercise that we do at hotspotting.com.au to try and identify the best places to buy. And so we think that this speaks very much to the keys to success in property investment, having access to the best information that money can buy. And important, I think, that for you as property investors or potential investors, that you make a choice. in terms of which path you'll choose. There's a fork on the road there. Off to the left, according to the image on the screen, you're treating investment as a hobby, just something you put a little bit of time into, as opposed to treating investment as a business, one that you allocate serious resources to, willing to put some time into it, willing to spend money on getting good advice from qualified professionals, and also paying for good information so that you can make the best choices and give yourself the best chance of succeeding with it. The choice often comes down to getting results, such as Barry sent me an email late last year because he hadn't done the legwork, he hadn't accessed good advice or good information, and had signed up to buy an apartment in what turned out to be an oversupplied inner city market in Brisbane. But having signed a contract to buy an apartment, read something that I'd written talking about the oversupply, and I think subsequently backed out of that deal, paid a cancellation fee and got out, which was probably a better result than actually persisting with that purchase, which would have resulted in an investment property that actually lost value rather than grew in value. And the flip side of that is a guy like Guy Williams, who's been getting our reports for many, many years and basing many of his buying decisions on our information. He's been a premium member for a long time. He now owns a portfolio of about 40 properties. But what I like about the Guy Williams approach is he treats property investment as a business. He has his own business, a day job, very successful business, but he also treats property investment as a second business. And he has a team of advisors that he knows and trusts that give him good advice in the area of accountancy, borrowing, and information. He gets a lot of the information he uses from us as a premium member. So I want to talk a little bit as we get towards the end of the presentation. One of the solutions that we offer to you as property investors or potential investors, and that is the mentoring service that I do, where I do one-on-one mentoring with a small number of people, and giving my mentoring clients the benefit of more than 30 years as a researcher and writer and investor in residential property. And it's a process where we help the mentoring clients understand their objectives, understand their borrowing capacity, their risk profile, develop a strategy in conjunction with them, then help them implement that strategy by targeting good locations as identified by our research, and getting good properties in those good locations as part of an overall strategy. And it's kind of a hand-holding process where we help our mentoring process. They do a lot of the lead work, but we're there providing advice and feedback and guiding them so that they go about it the right way. So I'd urge all of you to consider that kind of service as a means of getting the best results out of property investment. One of the benefits of being one of our mentoring clients is you are in effect a premium member, which means you have access to all the relevant reports that we publish on the best places to buy. And we do have reports. We have national reports like National Top 10 Best Buyers. We have Top 5 Hotspots reports in all the major cities and some of the regional areas as well. We have a monthly newsletter called the Ryder Report. And you have access to all that information as premium members and as mentoring clients as we work through the process of trying to get good results for you from property investment. Potential outcome, Anthony is one of my current mentoring clients. He's based in Melbourne. He's in his early 30s, and his objective is to retire by the age of 45. So he's got 13 years to get there. He's already well down the track in terms of building a portfolio that's going to allow him to do that. Anthony owns 6 properties, current value of about 2.7 million. And if he did nothing else, you would find that if that portfolio grew on an average of about 5% a year over the next 13 years, by the time he gets to that age of 45, it would be worth over 5 million. But if he gets better growth rates, for example, if it averages 9% a year, that portfolio would be worth something close to 9 million. And that's if he does nothing more, but he's not complacent. He wants to do more. He wants to invest more, and I'm helping him do it through the mentoring service, and we're working through processes now to add to the portfolio so that increases his chances of achieving that goal of retiring at the age of 45. just over 10 years' time. The question is, where is he going to go next? There's so many options, and that's where the mentoring service is so good at providing guidance for people about where they should be considering and why, and how different locations and different types of property fit into the strategy that we've devised together. So Brisbane's a possibility. Hobart was a possibility. Probably the best time to buy there is past. Perth is a city of opportunity because it's now recovering. The buying's good after 4 years of declining prices, and not much competition in that market right now, but there will be as more and more people realise that market's rising again. Adelaide, a very underrated market worth considering, great value for money market with growth potential. Various regional markets such as the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, the Newcastle region in New South Wales, Ballarat in Victoria. Townsville in northern Queensland is a market that's currently down, but I think it's going to show great growth. And within those locations, there's all sorts of different strategies that might be considered just simply buying and renting, passive investment, or buying a place that has the potential to add value for renovation, or increasingly investors and mentoring clients are amongst these people who are looking for opportunities to do more than just have the property that they buy as a rental proposition. They want to buy where the zoning allows further development. Maybe down the track they can build townhouses or an additional dwelling on that site. So there's a lot of different options available to people, but it's a very good idea to have somebody experienced like myself on your team providing guidance. And that's what the mentoring service provides. Always when I do a webinar or a seminar, I always like to have a special offer for people who are listening in to give people an opportunity to take advantage of a special offer. With mentoring, we ask that people make a commitment of at least 4 months. People can stay in longer if they want, but we feel that 4 months is the minimum to achieve a good result in terms of developing a plan, a strategy, goals and objectives and all of that, and start looking at locations that are going to be appropriate to the strategy that we devise. Now, most people pay for the mentoring service on a month-to-month basis, but the special offer is that if you pay for 4 months up front, just go back there and act this week, before end of this week, Friday 18th of May, we'll give it to you at a 26% discount, which means you'll save over $1,300. So what to do next if you're interested, to consider as a way of sampling the experience of talking through strategy with me. I do offer a one-off strategy session, which is 45 minutes, one-to-one discussion, either via Zoom or Skype, where you can sort of get a feel for how it might be to deal with me as a mentor. There's no obligation to go any further other than the one-off strategy session, but it's a good way to sample it. And if you're interested in having a look at that, it's featured right now on the homepage of the hotspotting.com.au website. And if you want to do more, want to know more, got some questions, this is how you contact me. Either send me an email at ryder@hotspotting.com.au, or you could give me a call on the mobile. Happy to take your call and talk about the various things that the ways in which we can help with informational advice. The mentoring program, the one-on-one strategy session, or premium membership. Okay, so that's the main message that I want to impart to you today, the importance of having good information and good advice if you want to be truly successful investment. Treating it as a business, not as a hobby, be willing to put in some serious time and perhaps spend some money on the process before you spend the big money, which is, of course, buying property. Now, turning to some of the questions that have come through whilst I've been doing my presentation. One of the people watching was asking whether when I'm talking about hotspots, are referring to residential only. Do you have any advice for commercial investments? Well, the answer is yes, it's residential only. We're kept very busy as specialists of residential property only. We don't have any involvement with commercial investments, although I would suggest that many of similar principles in terms of what drives growth in property markets would apply equally to commercial as it does to residential. Graham is asking the question, do you see evidence of the banks tightening their lending? And is interest-only lending going to be more difficult the future. Well, it's the lending market is ever changing. Changes almost daily, I think. I feel sorry for mortgage brokers trying to keep up with all the different, there's so many different deals out there, and so many different lenders. APRA intervenes with clampdowns in various areas that affect short-term change, but after a period of adjustment, things get back to normal. The Banking Royal Commission is probably going to have an impact, but there's always a lending package out there for everybody, I think. I'm going through a process right now myself. I'm doing some refinancing, and certainly there are multiple options available. Hasn't been particularly difficult to achieve what I want to achieve. Interest-only lending, there's a speed limit on that, but it certainly isn't a ban. So interest-only loans are going to be still available once the banks have adjusted their portfolios in line with the APRA restrictions. So that's still going to be a possibility moving forward. Edwin is asking, our adult daughter's training in the property market is well and truly priced out of Sydney, but now looking to areas in New South Wales outside of Sydney to buy real estate. Blue Mountains is one of the options. Armidale is another one that Edwin mentioned, in Coffs Harbour. Look, they all have their merits. I think Coffs Harbour's been through a period of growth. I think Armidale might be coming into a period of growth. The Blue Mountains is one of those near city areas that have had some spin-off already from the Sydney boom. I'd perhaps be suggesting, Edward, that she broadens her horizons, and if she's going to buy an investment, probably look to an area that hasn't yet had a great deal of price growth. For example, Newcastle already has, but areas close to Newcastle, some of the towns out in the Hunter Valley near Newcastle, haven't had the same level of price growth, so it might be an argument for focusing on those areas rather than Newcastle. But look at the areas that have had growth already, and perhaps focus on the areas that have potential for that kind of growth but haven't had it yet. A broad question. What do you do to find out the real deal when you're offered something, what's good and what's not? Well, it's a very, very broad question. I think that's one of the benefits of having good advice. There's no way to answer that question in a sentence. There are so many variables. You really need to have trusted advisors, people that you know and trust, and can trust that you're getting the right advice. And that's what I do with my mentoring service. Analyse your situation, help you establish objectives, and then a strategy to achieve those objectives, and then start looking at locations that make sense, locations that have potential to rise. Otherwise, you're flying blind out there. There's all sorts of propaganda in the market, people offering deals, and often there's no way of knowing whether it's a good or a bad one if you don't have access to good advice. Philip, what are your thoughts on buying property like stock in a business? Buy low, get the growth, might then sell. Philip, I tend to think that you're best to take a long-term approach with real estate. I mean, there are ways to profit by buying, perhaps adding value and selling, but I'd suggest holding long-term and building a portfolio, using the equity that grows to buy more property is the best way to go. I think, increasingly buy property that has some sort of value-adding opportunity and just put it in your portfolio and hang on to it. And then add to your portfolio. I think that's the, the best approach. Philip's also asking, where do you think Hobart is in the cycle? Look, I think Hobart's well advanced in the cycle now. Would be close to peaking. It's been strong for a couple of years. The best time to buy there was a couple of years ago. I wouldn't suggest getting into Hobart now. Property selling very, very quickly. It's very difficult to take your time and do things. Probably do your due diligence because it's so hot. And the best opportunities to buy at the best prices have passed. So I'd be suggesting perhaps looking at another market where it's just beginning a cycle. And I would suggest Perth is one of those places. Adelaide is another possibility. Brisbane's another possibility. And some of the regional centres. Townsville, North Queensland, I think it's a great example of a market that's primed for growth, but hasn't yet started to grow, and the buying there is pretty good. Philip's also asking, if you're a premium member, is the mentoring service part of the membership? Well, no, it's not. It's a separate service. But conversely, if you are getting the mentoring service, you have access to all our reports, so you're in effect a de facto premium member. For people who already are premium members and are interested in the mentoring service, talk to me, and I'd be happy to work out an arrangement that perhaps makes mentoring available to you at a discounted price in recognition of the fact that you are a premium member. Linda asking, we have good equity in a couple of properties already. Want to continue investing heading towards retirement. Looking at doing some subdivision. Do I think it's a good strategy? Look, I think there's plenty of opportunities to accelerate the process by doing that. So I think like buying a splitter block, for example, it's a block where you have the capacity, house on the existing block, but you have the capacity for it to be divided into two. It's already allowed under the zoning. Often it involves picking up the house that's on them and moving it sideways, and then you have two properties to sell. Perhaps renovate the existing house. You can build a house on the second property or just sell this land. But those sorts of strategies I think are good, but you do need to know something about what you're doing. Now, Linda, if you'd like to contact me, on the screen you've got my phone number and my email address. I can perhaps give you some pointers on how to become a little bit better educated in some of those strategies. It's also something that I could help you with via the mentoring service. Pramendra, want to buy a house for living in Sydney Southwest and rent the current one I'm living. Is it still worth to buy a house in Sydney and wait till prices go down? Well, there is potential for some price correction in Sydney, Pramendra. I don't think it's going to be particularly pronounced. Sydney's boom has come out of the strength of the local economy and the spending on infrastructure and all those factors, population growth. Those factors are still in place. So that's going to underpin the new level of values. There is going to perhaps be some price correction in some markets, but I don't expect it to be a great deal. I guess, but if you're going to buy in Sydney, I would suggest buying, following the infrastructure trail. Look at where all the new infrastructure is happening, because that's where that's going to be a generator of future growth. Buy property that lies in the path of progress, and certainly the southwest and the west of Sydney are two places to look for that. And finally, a question from someone asking, are you primarily focusing on buy and hold strategies? That's the basis, I think, of a good real estate investment strategy, but it's not the only one. I think the best way to achieve wealth in property investment is to create a portfolio and continue adding to it. Buy good property, put it in your portfolio, and over time add to it. Up come a point in time where you want to sell something to release equity or do something else, reduce your debt on some of the other properties, things like that. But I think buy and hold is a very good strategy rather than a buy and sell at a profit. Sort of losing a lot of your gains through capital gains tax, for example. There's a lot of work involved in that. There are some downsides to that kind of strategy. So buy and hold, but while looking for opportunities to add value. Okay, so those are most of the questions that have come through. And we've just clicked over the hour. So a lot of people who are watching during lunch breaks would need to be getting back to work. So it's an opportune time to close the presentation. Thank you for participating, those of you who are watching and listening. Just to reiterate the key messages, very, very important, I think, if you're going to be successful in property investment, to take it seriously, to put some serious time in, to treat it as a business, and to have access to good information. And I believe that my business, hotspotting.com.au, is a great source of good information, particularly in terms of the best places to buy and the places to avoid. And if you'd like some extra assistance, please consider the mentoring service that I provide as something that can help you perhaps accelerate the process of achieving success in property investment. And if you'd like to sample it, there's the option of having a one-off strategy session, which I mentioned earlier, which you can find more about by going to the homepage of hotspotting.com.au. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks for listening. Hope you got some value out of it. If you'd like to ask questions or follow up, contact details on the screen, Ryder at Hotspotting, etc., or phone me on my mobile 0408 011 595. I'd be happy to take your call and answer your questions. That's it for now. Terry Ryder from Hotspotting signing off. Talk to you again soon.